The Battle of Britain. 357 years ago, Drake and his men fought off the Spanish Armada. We still read and talk about that story with pride. But in years to come, the memory of the Armada will live on, coupled with that of a much more recent event. The Battle of Britain, another very narrow shave that turned into a war-winning victory. Here tonight, in the series Now It Can Be Told, is Wing Commander Ronald Adams, who throughout the Battle of Britain sent up and controlled the fighters from one of our forward airfields on the Thames estuary. Wing Commander Adams.
When I was ordered to report to Hornchurch in 1939, the piece of paper was marked A and SD Ops. I knew that A and SD meant Administrative and Special Duties Branch, but Ops conveyed nothing to me. In my flying days of the last war, there had been no such expressions. But when I first entered the operations room, I realized that that was what Ops stood for. And I stood and stared at the plotting table underneath the strong arc lights and wondered how long it would take me to assimilate and understand all the details of this queer room. For my first tour of duty, I was put beside another officer a few weeks more experienced than myself, and I faced a bewildering number of telephone keys. They all had little labels above them, showing where they were supposed to be connected, but the labels had a habit of shifting about, and it was possible to think that you were phoning to a squadron at dispersal huts and find yourself connected to a surprised air marshal. One officer at that time was so horrified when a number of buzzes sounded simultaneously that he'd cover the keys with a newspaper and try to ignore them. But he didn't last in Ops for very long. But after a few weeks, I found myself transferred to the controller's chair with all the business of radio telephony patter to learn and how to guide our own pilots to make contact with the enemy. A vector meant to give him a course to steer. Bandits meant German aircraft. So many angels meant so many thousand feet in height. And the electric phrase, tally-ho, from the pilot, meant that your directions to him had been successful and he'd sighted the enemy and was going to engage him. The days of that phony war were interesting because we were learning a new job. We practiced with our aircraft incessantly, and every now and then the enemy obligingly put in an appearance over the North Sea, and more often than not was successfully engaged. The radio stations round our coast, those tall masts that puzzled people before the war, were able to pick up and identify the enemy. The information was passed to us, and our plotters plotted it with arrows in a great table map below us. We could find out the position of our own fighters from their radio transmissions, and so a thrilling game of hide-and-seek developed while we waited for the tally-ho. Radar was in its infancy in those days, and the enemy certainly didn't appreciate its possibilities. Nor, thank goodness, did we in Ops fully appreciate its limitations, or we might have been more worried. The technicians knew, of course, but they didn't split. For it wasn't all that accurate, and there were times when it could fail to give any information at all. If the enemy had known just how to outwit it, which he could have done quite simply, the Battle of Britain would have to have been fought in a very different way, with perhaps a different ending. Most mornings, soon after first light, the milk train made its appearance. We called it the milk train because it appeared on the map somewhere west of the Dutch islands at regular times and pursued a regular course, coming down to reconnoiter our sea approaches. They were wily aircraft, but we got some of them from time to time, and the boys came back to their breakfasts exultantly. The Battle of Holland and of Belgium and of France developed, and things were pretty tough. But it was Dunkirk that made my spirits rise again. I can't believe that the much vaunted Luftwaffe didn't put out its best efforts to prevent the evacuation from those Dunkirk beaches. And it was then that the fighter boys showed just what they could do to the Luftwaffe. For the handful of them that were available clawed the enemy out of the sky. I know that the Army wondered where the aircraft were. They couldn't be expected to realize that a few dozen fighters were engaging hundreds of the enemy out of sight over the sea. I thought then, if that's what the fighters can do, there's hope for us, if only we can get some more. Then came the astonishing lull during July that puzzled us. We all knew how limited our resources were, how few aircraft and trained pilots we'd got ready for action, and we didn't and we couldn't understand why the enemy didn't come for us at once. There was about a 6 weeks pause. We held our breath during it. And then, early in August 1940, the radar plots began to show the enemy assembling in the air behind Cape Grisnez in France. There he was, milling around as one formation after another joined up. And we went to our loudspeakers when our group headquarters gave the order, telling the squadrons to take off. Scramble was the word we used. Scramble, we'd say. Vector 140, Angels 20. And Spitfires would tear into the sky and go off on their course over Maidstone, climbing to 20,000 feet to meet the oncoming enemy. As he came, we'd sit there on the ground and watch the plots and gather such information as we could from the Royal Observer Corps and from our Army liaison officers. We'd pass information to the pilots, telling them all changes in the enemy's direction, how he was splitting up into different formations, what height he was flying at, and guiding our fighters to the most advantageous position up in the eye of the sun, ready to attack. The Battle of Britain is summarized for me in one snatch on the radio telephone from a famous New Zealand fighter who is still alive. I heard his voice in my ear as he sighted the enemy. "Christ almighty! Tally-ho! Whole bloody hordes of them!" That'll forever be to me the Battle of Britain. Whole hordes of them. During the next 6 weeks, as so many of us watched the battle in our skies in the southeast corner of England, from just before dawn until after last light of those days of outstanding summer weather, the Spitfires flew and flew, and the air crackled, not only with the explosions, but with the voices of the controllers on the radio and the answers of the pilots and the breathless messages they passed to one another. When we came out of that strange bungalow building so near the main hangars of the aerodrome, we'd stroll around in the sunlight to the pilots' dispersal huts on the other side and see them stretched out on beds or in wicker chairs, fast asleep, with their Mae Wests slung loosely upon them and their clumsy flying boots on their feet. Every time the telephone bell rang in the dispersal hut, or every time a voice was heard booming on the loudspeaker, all the sleeping figures would wake up and listen. And if it wasn't an urgent call for them, they'd fall back and be asleep in an instant. Generally, the radio was on at full blast. That didn't disturb them. The roar of aircraft taking off and the clatter of vehicles passing by, those didn't disturb them either. But a telephone bell had them alert and grabbing for their flying helmets before it had stopped ringing. Often they were pretty nearly out on their feet. For instance, after one long day's flying, one of our boys landed, and the Spitfire trundled along the ground and came to rest, and nobody got out of it. The ground crew rushed out and tried to help their pilot, but he was slumped in his cockpit. He wasn't wounded. He was just fast asleep. The ground crews themselves, stripped to the waist, worked day and night rearming and refueling and repairing, because the stock of replacements kept going down, and the margin was getting narrower and narrower as the days went by. Occasionally, some lone ferry pilot would arrive with a replacement, a new or patched-up Spitfire. That was only on rare occasions. In those days, and at the beginning of September 1940, although I didn't know it at the time, we were actually down to a few days' replacements. And that was all that stood between us and many grim possibilities. I don't think the boys had any conscious idea of being heroic. They've a horror of what they call line shooting. We none of us had any real knowledge of how desperate things were in fact, but we realized, without needing facts, that this would be the end if it couldn't be withstood. The boys' abounding high spirits were rather stilled by September. They were strained and silent, but never for one instant did they fail to leap for their aircraft like scalded cats the moment the scramble was given. But when a wing went up, instead of the normal 36 aircraft taking the air, we'd be lucky if we could scrape up 10. Solidly and speedily the enemy poured across the Straits of Dover, and still that magic eye of the radar spotted him, and still the tired pilots went up to shoot him down while he bombed their landing grounds beneath them. I remember in one of those bombing raids kneeling with the telephone in my hand. It was some sort of psychological comfort to kneel rather than to stand upright, and I suddenly found myself undoing the sock suspender of the controller standing beside me. I can recall the irritated shakes of the leg he gave for a minute or two as the suspender dangled against his ankle. I remember getting the depleted squadrons off the ground to meet an oncoming raid, and they were all off, except the last section of 3, when the bombs fell. All 3 aircraft had opened up their throttles to take off. The first was blown upside down and slid about 200 yards on its cockpit. The second was blown in the air, and both its wings fell off. The third was blown clean out of the aerodrome and into a nearby brook. In the middle of the smoke and confusion, a pitched battle raged in the middle of the aerodrome. The undamaged pilot of the second aircraft had run to the first one. He'd managed to pull the pilot of it out and was trying to carry him. Eric was a little fellow, and he'd a great admiration for the big husky pilot he was trying to save. But the husky pilot had no wish to be saved by Eric, and the protests he made ended in a furious battle. This raid drove Operations Room away from its aerodrome, and it retired to an emergency pitch some 4 miles away, in a small, unoccupied grocer's shop, where we almost sat on one another's laps to control. We were bombed there within a few days of setting up. So the heat was turned on, and grew throughout August and the opening days of September until the historic day of September the 15th. I was controller on duty that night when my group rang through to give the score. 185 enemy aircraft destroyed. 14 pilots lost on our side. It wasn't the end of the Battle of Britain, but it was the beginning of the end. Less and less enemy bombers came, with more and more enemy fighters trying to protect them. And now, more ferry pilots arrived, with more aircraft and more pilots to fly them. Still, we knew there was much ahead to endure, but we also knew that what we'd suspected at Dunkirk had come true. We had taken the measure of the Luftwaffe and thrashed his hordes with a handful of fighter pilots. Perhaps as many people as you'd see on a Saturday afternoon collected round the field at the village cricket match.